The diner felt different now. The silence wasn't just awkward. It was heavy, thick with something unspoken. The officers weren't sure whether to keep standing there or walk away, but either way, they had already lost control of the moment. The older man wasn't looking at them anymore. He calmly picked up his coffee, taking a slow sip, as if the conversation didn't concern him. But everyone else was watching. The other customers, the waitresses, even the cook peeking out from the kitchen window, all of them waiting to see what would happen next. The officer who had spoken last cleared his throat again, trying to find a way out of the mess they had walked into. Vietnam, huh? He muttered, shifting uncomfortably. My grandfather fought there. His voice trailed off, as if he wasn't sure where to take the sentence. The truth was, he had come in here ready to intimidate someone, but now, standing before this man, a veteran who had likely seen more hardship in a year than he had in his entire life, he suddenly felt small. The second officer, still rigid, glanced around, realizing how many eyes were on them. His hand twitched at his belt again, a nervous reflex, but he didn't say anything. He just looked at the coin on the table, then at the older man, then back at the coin. The waitress, still standing nearby, narrowed her eyes. You know, she said, folding her arms, it's funny how quick some folks are to judge. Her voice was steady, but there was fire behind it. She had seen these officers before. She knew their type, the kind that walked into places like this thinking they owned it, looking for easy targets, for people they thought wouldn't fight back. But today, they had picked the wrong man. The older man finally set his cup down. He studied the two officers for a moment, his expression unreadable. What unit? He asked suddenly, his voice calm but firm. The first officer hesitated. Up, what? The older man nodded toward the patch on his uniform. Your unit. What's your division? The officer blinked, taken off guard. He glanced down at his uniform, suddenly unsure how to answer, as if the question itself had rattled him. The second officer, still silent, shifted again, but now there was something different in his face. Something that looked a lot like guilt. The tension didn't break. If anything, it grew stronger. The officers weren't in control anymore, and everyone in that diner knew it. The officer's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His partner shifted uncomfortably beside him, glancing around as if hoping someone would step in and break the tension. But no one did. The diner was frozen in place, waiting. The older man's questions still hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. His eyes, calm yet piercing, stayed locked onto them, as if he could see straight through their uniforms, past the badges, past the authority they carried, and into something deeper, something they weren't prepared to face. The first officer finally spoke, his voice quieter now. 42nd, he muttered, almost unsure of his own words. But the way he said it didn't sound right. There was hesitation, a slight stammer, as if he was scrambling to find an answer that would save him from whatever was coming next. The older man didn't blink. He leaned forward just slightly, his hands still resting on the table, his movements slow, deliberate. 42nd. He repeated, as if testing the words. His tone didn't accuse, didn't challenge, but somehow it carried more weight than if he had shouted. The officer swallowed hard. His partner stayed silent, his eyes darting toward the door. The waitress shifted her weight, watching the exchange closely. The other customers did the same, their curiosity now mixed with something else, a sense that the officers weren't just uncomfortable. They were exposed. The older man let a beat of silence stretch between them before he finally spoke again. I trained with the 42nd, he said, almost casually, stirring his coffee. Back in the day, before we shipped out. He let the words sink in, watching the officers for any sign of recognition. We lost a lot of good men in that division, he continued. Hard to forget something like that. The first officer's jaw tightened. He nodded slightly, as if he wanted to agree, but something about his body language betrayed him. The second officer glanced at him, then back at the older man. The realization was setting in. This wasn't just a quiet old man at a diner. This wasn't someone they could brush off or intimidate. This was someone who had lived the kind of life they only pretended to understand. Another long silence. The second officer took a half step back, gripping his belt like it was a lifeline. The first officer clenched his fists at his sides. They both knew it now. Everyone did. They had picked the wrong man, and there was no walking away from it. It started like any other afternoon at a small-town diner. Regulars chatting over coffee, the smell of fresh pancakes in the air, and waitresses hurrying between tables. But in the middle of it all, something was off. A man sat alone at a corner booth, quietly minding his business. He was an older gentleman, dressed simply, with a calm, dignified presence. What stood out wasn't just his quiet demeanor, but the way two uniformed officers had locked their eyes on him the moment they walked in. From the second they stepped inside, the officer's expression shifted. They whispered between themselves, sneering as they glanced over at the man's dark skin, his strong build, and the way he sat with quiet confidence. Without hesitation, they marched over to his table, towering over him with forced smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The air in the diner grew tense as nearby customers lowered their voices, sensing the shift in energy. "Hey there," one of the officers said, his voice laced with condescension. "You lost, old man? Didn't think folks like you dined around here." His partner chuckled under his breath, eyeing the man's worn jacket, trying to gauge his reaction. But the man didn't flinch. He simply looked up at them, his face unreadable, his hands resting on the table as if he had all the time in the world. A waitress, clearly uneasy, rushed over. "Everything okay here?" she asked nervously, glancing between the officers and the older man. The officers ignored her. They weren't done. "You sure you can afford to eat here?" the second officer asked, his tone sharper now. "Wouldn't want any trouble." The diner had gone completely silent now. People were watching, waiting. The older man still hadn't said a word. Instead, he let out a slow breath, and without a trace of anger, motioned toward something sitting right next to his plate. The officer's eyes flicked downward, then suddenly, their smug expressions disappeared. Their jaws clenched, their posture stiffened, and for the first time, they looked uneasy. What they saw on the table changed everything. The diner remained completely still. Conversations had stopped, forks hovered in midair, and all eyes were locked on the scene unfolding at the corner booth. The officers who had moments ago carried themselves with smug confidence now seemed frozen. Their eyes remained fixed on the small object resting on the table, their faces tightening as they processed what they were looking at. It was a military challenge coin. Not just any coin, but one bearing a distinct emblem, a mark of honor, respect, and service. The kind of thing only those who had truly sacrificed for their country carried with them. The kind of thing these officers should have recognized instantly. A long, heavy silence hung between them. The older man still hadn't spoken, but he didn't need to. His presence alone spoke volumes. The officers exchanged glances, shifting uncomfortably, as if trying to figure out their next move. The smugness they had walked in with was gone, replaced by something else, something that looked a lot like shame. The waitress, still standing nearby, finally broke the silence. "Would you like some more coffee, sir?" she asked gently, her voice cutting through the tension. The older man gave her a small nod, a quiet appreciation in his eyes. As she poured the coffee, her hands steady, her eyes flickered toward the officers, almost daring them to say something else. They didn't. Instead, one of them cleared his throat, as if trying to regain control of the situation. "So, where'd you serve?" the first officer asked, his voice now lacking the arrogance it had before. But there was something else there, an edge of nervousness, like he already knew the answer would only make this moment worse for him. The older man finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, carrying the weight of someone who had seen more than these officers ever would. "Vietnam," he said simply. The word hit like a punch to the gut. A few customers in the diner let out small, almost involuntary reactions, whispers of understanding, nods of respect. Vietnam wasn't just a war. It was an experience, a sacrifice, a history that had left scars, both seen and unseen. The officers shifted again, suddenly looking out of place in their own uniforms. Their hands twitched at their belts, their confidence unraveling. Whatever power they thought they had in this moment had just slipped away. And the older man, he hadn't even needed to raise his voice. Jonathan took another slow step forward. "I asked if *U** take full responsibility." His voice was calm, but there was something sharp beneath it. "Because from where I'm standing, this isn't just about Emily. This is about the culture in this hotel. The way people like my mother are treated the second they step inside." Michael swallowed hard. I assure you, this was an isolated incident." Jonathan arched a brow. "Was it?" He pulled his phone from his pocket, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around. On the display was security footage, clear as day, of Emily dismissing Margaret without checking the system. Jonathan swiped again, revealing more clips. Different guests, different days. Employees glancing at certain guests with the same dismissive expression Emily had worn. Guests being ignored, being brushed aside. Emily gasped. Michael's face turned ghostly white. "You were saying?" Jonathan asked smoothly. The lobby was so quiet that even the hum of the air conditioning felt deafening. Emily looked like she might burst into tears, but Jonathan barely spared her a glance now. His attention was fully on Michael. "Tell me something, Michael," Jonathan continued. "How long have you been in charge here?" Michael's throat bobbed. 3 years. Jonathan nodded slowly. 3 years, he echoed. "And you expect me to believe this is the first time something like this has happened?" Michael didn't answer. He couldn't. Margaret exhaled softly, watching as the weight of the situation settled over the room. Jonathan had come here expecting to check in on his mother. Instead, he had uncovered something much bigger. And now, all eyes were on him, waiting to see what he would do next. Michael's mouth opened, but no words came out. The color had drained from his face, and for the first time, he looked truly rattled. He had built a career on smooth-talking his way out of difficult situations, but this was different. There was nowhere to run, no excuse to hide behind. The security footage on Jonathan's phone spoke louder than any words ever could. Jonathan let the silence stretch. He wanted Michael to feel the weight of this moment, to understand that the problem ran deeper than one receptionist making a bad decision. This was a pattern, a culture that had been allowed to exist under his leadership. Emily shifted beside him, her breathing uneven. "Sir, She started, but Jonathan didn't look at her. His attention was still on Michael. "You've had 3 years," Jonathan said finally, his voice even but firm. 3 years to build a hotel that treats all guests with dignity. And yet, here we are. Michael inhaled sharply. I take full responsibility. I can fix this." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "Fix it?" He let the word settle. "Michael, I don't need you to fix this. I need you gone. Michael's eyes widened. "Sir." "You're fired," Jonathan said, his tone calm but unwavering. "Effective immediately." A stunned silence filled the lobby. Emily let out a small gasp, and a few employees standing nearby exchanged shocked glances. Michael took a step back, his mouth opening and closing like he was still trying to process what had just happened. You can't be serious," Michael finally stammered. Jonathan raised a brow. "I don't say things I don't mean." Michael straightened his tie, his hands trembling slightly. "You don't understand the logistics. They—" "I understand perfectly," Jonathan interrupted. "You were trusted to run this hotel, and instead, you let it become a place where guests like my mother are disrespected. That's not the kind of business I run." Michael exhaled shakily, his mind racing. Then suddenly, something flickered in his expression. A smirk. A quiet, desperate confidence. "You might own this hotel, Jonathan, but there are contracts, agreements. You can't just fire me on the spot without legal consequences." Jonathan smiled, small, knowing. "You're right." He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out an envelope, holding it between two fingers. "That's why I had my legal team review everything before I got here." Michael's smirk faded. Jonathan handed him the envelope. "Your termination papers. You violated company policies, and based on the evidence I have, you've done it more than once. Consider this your official notice." Michael snatched the envelope, his face twisted in disbelief. He opened it, scanned the contents, and then, for the first time, looked truly defeated. He knew there was no way out of this. Jonathan turned back to Emily, who looked like she was bracing for her own downfall. "As for you," Jonathan said, his voice measured, "I'm giving you a choice." She swallowed hard. "You're the new owner." Jonathan nodded. "That's right." He let that sink in before continuing, his voice calm but unwavering. "And you know how I got here? How I ended up owning this hotel?" Emily shook her head quickly. "No, sir." Jonathan leaned against the counter slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I built my career from the ground up. I wasn't handed this. I wasn't born into wealth. Everything I have, I worked for. My mother," he motioned toward Margaret, who was still watching quietly, "sacrificed everything so I could have the opportunities she never did. So when I see someone like you treat her as if she doesn't belong here, I take that very, very personally." Emily's hands clenched at her sides. "I didn't mean." Jonathan held up a hand, cutting her off. "I don't want excuses. I want you to understand what just happened here. You looked at my mother and assumed she didn't belong. Not because of anything she did, but because of how she looks. And that?" His voice dropped lower, quieter, but somehow even more powerful. "That is unacceptable." Emily's throat tightened. She could feel the weight of her mistake pressing down on her, but she didn't know what to say. She had thought she was just doing her job, but now, standing in front of the man who held her future in his hands, she realized how wrong she had been. Margaret finally stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her son's arm. "Jonathan," she said softly. He exhaled slowly, glancing at his mother. There was no anger on her face, only that same quiet patience she had always carried. Emily watched, her heart pounding. The air in the room felt charged, like something was about to happen, something that would change everything. Jonathan held his mother's gaze for a long moment, his jaw still tense, but the way she looked at him, calm, steady, was enough to make him take a breath. Margaret had always had that effect on him, even when he was a boy. She had taught him strength, but also patience. And right now her eyes were telling him something. Asterisk, choose your next move carefully, asterisk. Emily shifted on her feet, feeling the tension in the air thicken. "Sir," she started again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I really am sorry. It was a mistake." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. A mistake? He let the word linger between them. "You see, Emily, mistakes are things like misplacing a room key or charging the wrong credit card. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice." Emily's lips parted, but before she could speak, a new voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Carter, is there a problem here?" Everyone turned. A middle-aged man in a navy blue suit strode toward them, his expression tight with concern. He had the polished, rehearsed smile of someone used to smoothing over uncomfortable situations. Jonathan recognized him instantly, Michael Lawson, the hotel's general manager. Jonathan's eyes darkened slightly. "Michael," he said, his tone cool. Perfect timing. Michael's gaze flickered toward Margaret, and for a split second, something unreadable passed across his face. Then he turned to Emily, who looked as if she might collapse under the weight of all the eyes on her. "What's going on?" Michael asked carefully. Jonathan folded his arms, watching him. "Emily here decided my mother didn't belong in my asterisk hotel. She denied her reservation, refused to check again, and told her to leave. All without bothering to verify the facts." Michael's face paled. "I see," he said slowly, his polished exterior cracking just a bit. He turned sharply to Emily. "Is this true?" Emily opened her mouth, then closed it again, her eyes darting between the two men. I didn't mean." Michael held up a hand. "I don't want to hear it." Then he turned back to Jonathan, his smile returning, though weaker than before. "Mr. Carter, please accept my deepest apologies. This is absolutely unacceptable, and I assure you it will be handled immediately." Jonathan didn't reply right away. He studied Michael, something calculating behind his eyes. Then, as if making a decision in real time, he took a step closer. "Handled how?" Jonathan asked. Michael hesitated. "Well, I'll personally ensure disciplinary action is taken." Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Disciplinary action," he repeated. "Interesting." Margaret watched the exchange with a knowing look, but she said nothing, letting her son take the lead. Michael cleared his throat. "I promise you, sir, this does not reflect the values of Grand Haven Hotel. I take full responsibility." Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "Do you?" Michael froze. "Excuse me."